It is Friday morning, October the 4th, and it's about 9:15. And as planned, we are still in Cogden Cove. The weather forecast does still predict strong winds, 20-25 with gusts up to 30, and still small craft advisory. So the plan is to stay here, despite the fact that right at the moment, there's no indication of that at all. We have light breezes, maybe 5 out of the west. Not a cloud in the sky, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But we're having a very relaxing morning, and we're looking forward to having a long and relaxing day. I'm sure we'll get bored, somewhere along the ways, although we'll try to think up ways to keep ourselves amused. So one of the things that we'll be doing is using the clear skies and the strong sunshine to try to bring the batteries back up to full charge, or as close as we can get. So it's currently, let me check. 78%. So that's not too bad, but I've been running the refrigerator at a lower setting to conserve electricity, so I've turned it up to high. So we'll let the refrigerator and the solar panels battle it out, and I'll keep it posted. That'll be riveting. Well, other than that, I'll give you updates during the day, and I have a few things in mind to talk about. So one of the things I wanted to talk about here on our day off from sailing is the subject of anchoring here on Silver Heels. So I've been developing an anchoring system, and I think I've got the design down, although not fully implemented. The general goal of this whole thing is to be able to both deploy and retrieve the anchor from the cockpit. And the first aspect of that that I did was to build the bowsprit over the last winter and installed the anchor roller on it. So now the anchor lives up there full time rather than in the lazarette. So I started practicing this season, or experimenting with deploying and retrieving from the bow, from the cockpit. And one of the things that I discovered is that while if you're up on the bow pulling in the anchor chain, when the anchor gets up to the bow roller, it's easy to give a little twist one way or the other to the chain to make sure the anchor is oriented correctly to come up on the roller. But if you're back in the cockpit, you really can't see it that well, and even if you could, there's no way to apply that twist. So I had to add a piece of hardware called an anchor turner that sits in the rode immediately behind the anchor. Now, at the moment, the anchor is, of course, in the water, so I can't show it to you. But hopefully I'll remember later to take some picture of it, and we can overlay that to my yakking. So attached to the anchor turner is 10 feet 1/4 inch chain. Most people recommend some chain in a rode. Some people think it's important because of weight. I happen to think it doesn't weigh enough to really matter in these things, but I think its primary benefit is in chafing protection. So, and then the chain is attached to the line section of the rode, 3/8 inch 3-strand nylon. Originally I had a shackle in here, but the shackle would tend to get hung up in the retrieval or deployment process. So we've spliced the line directly to the end of the chain. So the anchor rode is attached to the anchor and the anchor turner the entire time I'm out on a cruise. So it runs from the anchor back to a roller mounted to the aft end of the bowsprit, and turns around that and then comes back down along the side of the cabin on the deck and back to a cleat that's mounted on the forward more track that's there for the jib sheet. And the rode is cleated on the cleat on the track most of the time. The only time that it's not cleated there is during deployment or retrieval. When I'm getting ready to anchor, I uncleat the anchor rode from the cleat on the forward jib track and run the rode back to the jib sheet cam cleat. And I've got another horn cleat on the aft jib sheet track that I can temporarily tie off the jib sheet to. So when I decide it's time to let the anchor go, I can just pull the rode out of the jib sheet clamp cleat and off it goes. So can't get much easier than that. When it's time to retrieve the anchor, again I uncleat it from the cleat on the forward jib sheet track and run the rode around the jib sheet winch. And mostly I do that because it gives me a better direction to pull from. I can stand right in the center of the cockpit and pull in the rode, and usually that's easy enough. In more challenging situations like yesterday in Cuttyhunk Harbor, I will take several wraps on the winch and actually break out the winch handle and use the winch to pull in the rode, and that really was necessary yesterday. I don't know, I'm guessing I probably could have gotten the anchor in by hand, but it would have been a lot of more work, so that aspect works out too. And I'll still use the clam cleat occasionally. I'll pull in 10 feet of rode or so and then store that, and pull in another 10 feet and store that. And while I'm doing the storing, I'm using the clam cleat to hold things in place. So that gets to the subject of storage, and that's one of the undeveloped bits. The current plan is that I will install a fitting in the very aft portion of the cockpit coaming. And the fitting will allow the anchor rode to pass through and down into the aft corner of the lazarette. And some of the exact details of what happens then are still being worked out. But for the moment, what I'm doing is I've got the pail that my anchor rode lives in kind of strapped in place back in that corner of the cockpit. And, you know, that's working out. It just looks like hell. One final aspect of anchoring here on Silver Heels is I like to anchor off the bow eye rather than up on deck. Initially, I did that because someone in the archives of the Rhodes 22 group suggested that it would help to reduce the tendency of the boat to swing at anchor. And maybe it does help with that, but not enough. So I went on to using a riding sail to help address that issue. But I still anchor off the bow eye, primarily because it lowers the attachment point for the anchor rode. So since the bow eye is way down near the water, and that has the effect of lengthening the scope. And the way I do that is I have 10 feet of line that's attached to the bow eye. I call that line a painter, like on a dinghy. And after I've deployed the anchor and I'm satisfied that it's set, I'll attach the anchor rode to the painter and then let out enough rods so that the painter is taking the strain and not the rode. Now, I used to attach the painter to the rode using a rolling hitch, and that would usually work, although occasionally it would slip. Now, it's not a big deal when it slipped because the rode is still tied off, and if the rolling hitch slipped, the strain would just go to the rode, and nothing really would happen. But I saw on a YouTube video, these things can be useful, a different approach for attaching this painter, or in that case they were using what they called a bridle, to the rode, and I'll show you that. So this is what I use to attach the painter to the anchor rode. The YouTube video that I got this idea from called it, I think, a dog bone. I'm going to call it a toggle, because it reminds me of those gizmos sometimes used on winter coats instead of buttons. Anyway, it's made out of oak, 3 pieces of 3/4 inch oak glued together, so it's got a diameter across of about 2 1/4 inches. It's 8 inches long. It's got a hole in the middle that's a 1/2 inch wide and 1.5 inches long. And the purpose of that hole is to accept a section of the anchor rode. So you take a loop of the anchor rode and pass it through the toggle and then wrap it around like that. And now the toggle is firmly attached to the rode, and that won't go anywhere. So then you take the end of your painter, which has an eye on it. I got a bowline in this. The real painter has a spliced eye, and you just wrap it over the toggle. And now the painter will take the strain from the anchor instead of the rode, and that's not going anywhere. So what's set up now is an anchor on the port side. I'd like to also have an anchor on the starboard side, mounted the same way up on the bowsprit, and I'd duplicate the whole setup over there, so it would be symmetrical, which is very important. When I do get everything set up, I'll probably do a dedicated video just on this topic, so it won't be stuck in the middle of some other sailing stuff. Well, until then, you have the advanced word. Well, the afternoon is continuing to move along, and there's one other little topic that I thought I'd bring up, and that has to do with the dinghy. I'm sure you've noticed that I pretty much always am towing a dinghy when I go on these cruises, and I'm not sure exactly why, because I hardly ever use it, but well, it's there in case. Now, one aspect of towing a dinghy is that in a situation with following seas, it has a tendency to surf. And way back in the first year I had the boat, I actually lost a dinghy in that sort of situation. The dinghy surfed down waves, turned sideways when it did it, and took on water. And then it did it again and again, and soon the dinghy was full of water, and I lost it. I basically pulled the eye right out of the bow, which is probably the best way that the tow could have failed. So God knows where that dinghy ended up. Now that happened in the race, which is one of the reasons that I'm approached the race with a fair amount of caution. And I certainly haven't been in following seas that significant since. But I still worry about the possibility of that happening even in lower seas. And I think I've come up with a device that will make that situation, a repeat of that situation, less likely. So this is kind of a mini drogue, or maybe micro drogue. It's 25 feet of 3/8 line that I use for tying up the boat. And I've tied this kind of daisy chain knotted, and it's just loop after loop after loop, one to the next, to shorten it up and make it a better drogue. And I've got a carabiner at one end. So I've got a line that runs from corner to corner on the stern of the dinghy, and I clip that carabiner into that line and then toss the whole drogue thing off the aft end of the dinghy, and that produces enough drag that when the dinghy surfs in a following sea condition, it tends not to turn because it's got the drag at the aft end. And so I don't put that out all the time, only when I think I'm going to be in a condition with following seas, but it makes me feel better and I think it's working. Well, it's a little after 6 o'clock and the day is winding down. Dinner, which is a dehydrated meal, is doing its rehydrating as we speak. Excuse me. And the sun has gone down over the treetops. It's probably not quite official sunset, but very close. So, an uneventful day as it was supposed to be. The wind did blow quite a bit. I'm not, well, who knows what it looked like out there. I've discovered in the past, not on this boat really, there can be a huge difference between being just out on the water and being a short distance on shore. You know, it can be hellish on the water, and on shore it's a beautiful day. So that might be one of those. It was a beautiful day, clearly a little breezy in here. It seems to be calming down now as it's supposed to be. That's good, because I'd rather it wasn't blowing at night, so I can sleep better. Let's see what, electricity. It was also cloudier today than I hoped it would be, so we didn't reach our goal of getting back up to 100%. We hit 90, so which is going to be fine, but and I don't know how cloudy it's going to be tomorrow. But let's see, anything else? No, I don't think there is. You know, all in all, a very pleasant day, and I wasn't that bored. I finished a book. I'm starting another. And that's about it. All right, well, I'll show you dinner, and I think that'll be it for today. Okay, for dinner tonight, we've got a backpacking style dehydrated meal of chicken and rice with vegetables with some extra frozen peas added for color and flavor. And we've got a garden salad and some wine. Bon appetit.